So welcome to the grief support webinar that we are hosting today. My name is Candace Coughlin, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Living Organ Donation. And I am also a kidney transplant recipient myself. The Center for Living Organ Donation was created by UHN Transplant in 2018 to improve access to living organ donation for people who need a life-saving kidney or liver transplant and those who want to give a transformative gift of life. So today we are going to be discussing grief with two wonderful guests, and we are going to start with Stefan, who has been with UHN since 2014 when he started his clinical pastoral education program at TWH. He's provided coverage to multiple areas at UHN through his on-call work. Stefan has been providing support for the transplant program at Toronto General since August of 2019. He's a spiritual care family information and support center representative. He's a registered psychotherapist with the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario and is also registered as a spiritual care practitioner with the Canadian Association of Spiritual Care. Stefan completed his BA from Ottawa University and has a Sacred Bachelor's of Theology from St. Paul's University in Ottawa. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stefan. This is an incredibly important topic, and my family is going through some of this ourselves right now, and it's a very difficult time of year for many people. So we're very grateful to have you here and to share your knowledge. And again, for anybody who is listening or watching, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will have time at the end. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to you, and thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Candace, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen right now. I have a short PowerPoint presentation. Can you guys see that okay? Perfect. So, Candace, as you mentioned just now, this is it's quite an emotional time of year right now, and this is a pretty heavy-duty topic. You know, grief is it's not easy to engage with, but I'm going to do the best I can to try and talk you through some of the concepts of grief and what you can do with it. You know, grief is significant for many reasons. You know, we experience a loss in many aspects of our life, and you know, the process of grieving is similar to the process of physical healing. So I'm just going to go on with the presentation here quickly, that I have no actual or potential conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. And these are the objectives. So I want to explore very quickly attachment theory, define bereavement, mourning, and grief, some of the differences, some of the overlap between these concepts. I want to review the 4 tasks of grieving. And I know I did a similar presentation last year, and this presentation is similar in a lot of ways, but I want to focus in on a few different things, and the 4 tasks of grieving is one of those things. I want to explore a couple of different dimensions of grief. So I want to look at anticipatory grief, but also complex grief, what those are about. And then we're going to look at the emotions that are involved in grief. And even though there's so many and they're so intertwined, I wanted to just run through the 4 basic emotional kind of groups: mad, sad, glad, and afraid, and to kind of talk about what that's like in grief. Maybe get into a few ideas of how to process grief, and then quickly go over some online and community resources. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So let's get going. Attachment theory. So attachment theory, I thought it was important to, this is something that I didn't mention last year, but I thought it was important to bring this up because It's believed that our mental health and behavioral problems, they're all attributed to early stages in our lives. And this was kind of researched and brought forth by John Bowlby, who's a psychologist, psychiatrist, and a psychoanalyst. Human beings come into the world biologically pre-programmed to form attachments with others, because this will essentially help them to survive. This is the practical aspect of attachment, but at the same time, I would argue that the emotional kind of dimension of attachment is actually formulated in love. So we attach to folks around us because, biologically, practically, we need to survive. We need that kind of nurturing, but also we do it through to love, to have that sense of acceptance and love. And I thought a high-level overview of attachment theory is important because it helps to shine light on why we actually experience grief from both the mental health perspective, but also behavioral perspective. It's a way for us to conceptualize the tendency in human beings to make strong, affectionate bonds with others, and a way to understand the strong emotional reactions that occur when these bonds are threatened or broken, hence grief. And attachments come from the need for security, safety, and love, as I already said, which are developed very early in our life, directed towards a specific individual or a group of individuals, and tend to endure through a large part of our life. So this is actually illustrated very simply through animal behavior. As animals give birth to their youngins, as they get older and grow bigger and bigger, they start to kind of leave the nest. And every time they leave their home environment, they go further and further away. And the time period that they leave kind of increases. But when something happens to that attachment figure, an authority figure, they have an emotional and a very strong anxious reaction to that, because even though they leave, they always come back for that safety net. And it's the same thing with us human beings. We're relational beings that depend on relational bonds with one another. And when these bonds are broken, we have that emotional reaction. We grieve. You wanted to throw in a quote by Tolstoy that only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer great sorrow. But this same necessity of loving serves to counteract their grief and heal them. So that's a little bit about attachment theory and kind of where our instinctual reaction to loss comes from and why we grieve. I wanted to go over very quickly also the definitions of bereavement, mourning, and grief. I took these from the APA. Bereavement involves the time period right after the loss and when mourning occurs. So it begins at the moment that the actual loss occurs, and the response to losing a loved one is displayed in the form of grief. But you may not necessarily start grieving instantly, but your bereavement begins right away. And the way you respond to the news of the loss, that emotional response, is the grief. So that's what bereavement is. That's who the bereaved are. Mourning means to express your grief outside of yourself. So mourning is crying, it's talking to other people about the death, it's sharing stories, putting together photo albums, it's journaling. And mourning is essential because it's through mourning that you begin to heal. Mourning is actually what you want to do. You want to engage with the grief. You want to participate in the intense work of the grief. The natural journey of mourning involves a struggle between the need to evade the pain of the loss and encounter the pain of the loss. So are you leaning into the grief or are you leaning out? And I guess I'm kind of condoning that we want to lean in. We need to explore those emotions. And lastly, um, I want to talk about grief here, but specifically as uncomplicated grief. Um, and it's experienced through the process of death and not so much other losses. The grief is normal and a natural experience, although traumatic and disruptive, and really has no timetable. Grief often includes psychosocial distress, separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, obsession with dwelling on the past, a lot of uncertainty about the future. Um, and there are, I wanted to mention here 7 determinants of grief that are important to consider and to be aware of. It gives, I thought that, when I was reading up on this, it gives a lot of really good context as to why we grieve the way we grieve, and these determinants are, the very first one is, who was the person? Was it somebody that was really close to you, or not? Was there a certain, what was the nature of the attachment? That's the second determinant. And these determinants, as I go through them, I want you to keep in mind that they, in a lot of ways, they determine how you will grieve. The third determinant is the mode of death. So was it sudden? Was it traumatic? Was it unexpected? Or was there time for anticipatory grief to take place, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The next determinant is historical antecedents. So, like, have you experienced loss previously in your life? When we do that, when we have those experiences, we kind of tend to lean on them and draw from them as we encounter grief time and again in our life. I'm not sure if I mentioned it already, but grief is something, loss, grief, death, it's unfortunately a big part of life. There's no way around it. There's no stopping it. We all have to engage it and will engage it if we haven't. And it's tough. It's not easy to do. And that kind of leads into the next determinant, personality variables. So what is your own emotional intelligence like? What are your coping mechanisms? Do you think that they will sustain you through the grief? The next one is social variables. This one is tremendously important because it focuses on, like, community norms, cultural norms, religious norms. Different communities, different religious groups grieve in their own way. They have their own traditions, they have their own rituals, which actually help with the mourning process. They're the ones that help to kind of guide you along. And the last determinant, I think, is also crucial. It's concurrent stressors. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that when these things happen, when we encounter a loss in our life, when someone close to us dies, that doesn't mean that the world stops turning. And unfortunately, we can't just focus on that. Everything else continues. The bills need to be paid. Oftentimes, we need to return to work pretty quickly. We have other family members that we need to take care of, provide for, love, check in on. And those are all concurrent stressors that take their toll on us as we grieve. So that's a little bit about the uncomplicated grief and the determinants. Now I want to focus in on the four tasks of grieving. And there are other schools of thought about these. It runs parallel with other frameworks. I'm sure some of you have encountered denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. So it's very similar to that kind of framework. But I don't know, for some reason, I really identify strongly with these four. It really makes sense in my head. And again, I want you to keep in mind that this is just a framework. The first one is to accept the reality of the loss. Now, this might seem like common sense, and it is, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that we have many dimensions to ourselves. And the two that are very relevant here, well, three, but the two that I want to talk about are our logical selves and our emotional selves. And our emotional selves is often tied in with our spiritual selves. And when we go through something as big as a traumatic loss, or when we grieve, those aren't often not aligned. So our logical self understands that this loss is happening or has happened, but our emotional self isn't ready for that and cannot accept that. So there's a feeling of numbness. There's searching behavior that happens in this task. um that fact that I talked about in attachment theory, when we're looking for uh the security person, the person that we feel comfortable with, the person that we have drawn to love, we can't just detach from that person instantly when a death occurs. um and there's this denial of the facts of the loss, what actually happened, trying to wrap your mind around that. It's so tough. you know the next is the denial of the meaning of the loss, so trying to make sense of it. Yeah, and that can be from a slight distortion to a full-blown delusion that this just can't be happening. Oftentimes when I go in to meet people right after they've lost a loved one with at bedside, I kind of state for them that this must feel like just a really bad nightmare. And it does. When you're in that state of shock, when you're in that, there's this numbness that comes about you, it doesn't feel real. um then there's also the concept of irreversibility of the loss, trying to accept that this is actually permanent, that when you wake up from this nightmare, whatever has happened, and it wasn't a dream. It wasn't just something um, that you thought happened. It's happening. This task takes time because it's, as I said when I started talking about this task, that it takes a lot of time for our cognitive self and our emotional self to kind of balance out, and our emotions to start to catch up with that logical side of us. The second task is to engage the pain of the grief. And this is where I feel a lot of work happens in terms of our emotional work. The search and yearning, it turns into uh, engaging the really difficult emotions that we go through. And it's both physical and emotional pain. We, from our emotional pain, we can start feeling a lot of physical symptoms. Something we want to try to avoid is suppressing the pain, because all that does is it will prolong the mourning process. Remember I said that mourning is where we want to be. We want to let ourselves feel. We want to let ourselves be open to engaging those feelings. Oftentimes, in this task, in this stage, friends and family sometimes want to take the grief away from us, just want to make us feel better. It's hard for them to sit with us as we cry. It's hard for them to know what the right thing to say is. And that comes, like it always comes from a good place. It comes from the heart. But I think that care is misplaced, because grief isn't something, these intense emotions isn't something that you can fix. again, something that I say often to folks at bedside is I wish there was an easy way through it. I really do. I wish there was a framework like this that you can just follow, boom, 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 and it goes away. It's not that simple. It's not that straightforward, because engaging with these painful emotions, it's very tough. Um, Another thing we want to avoid and try to avoid in doing at this stage is to engage only pleasant memories. And that's sometimes easy to do, to reminisce and to talk about the good times. There's a time and place for that, absolutely, but that shouldn't be done to avoid the painful emotions of sadness, anger, fear. At times, to help with this kind of masking, people turn to maladaptive and destructive behaviors of drugs or alcohol to help numb the pain. And that's not a good thing for obvious reasons. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I explore complicated grief or complex grief. And kind of the last point I want to make here around this task is the sooner we engage it, the sooner we can process it. Sooner or later, the pain will surface. And as I said, worst case scenario, it turns into destructive habits, or it could even turn into a pretty severe depression. So the third, just moving along here, the third task is to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. So this is again where the determinants of the grief are very much at play here. And this task, it can take months to happen. I want to bring in a quote here from an author, Parks, that in any bereavement, it is seldom clear exactly what is lost. A husband, for instance, may or may not mean the loss of a husband, sorry, for instance, may or may not mean the loss of a sexual partner, a companion, an accountant, a gardener, a baby minder, an audience, a bed warmer, and so on, depending on the particular role normally performed by this husband. And the bereaved, we're not always ready for that. We're not always ready to explore all of these different roles that we've now just automatically inherited or need to be filled some way, somehow. And that's very difficult to do. It takes a long time to rebuild that. And in a way, it's when you're the person that's grieving, when you're the bereaved, you have to kind of reinvent yourself and rebuild your understanding of your self-identity. This task, it wasn't that long ago, a former patient of mine's a husband, we were talking about something different, and we were on the phone, and I just asked him how things were going, how the grief process is going, and he said, I've come to accept the loss, and I'm engaging, I'm mourning, and I'm at the stage now where I'm trying to figure out how to live without him. What am I supposed to do? How do I make sense of all of this? And to me, that was great. That means that this person is now on the road to heal. As difficult as it is, it's still on the road to healing. And the last task, the fourth task, is emotionally relocating the deceased and trying to re-engage life. And this is where it becomes very tricky. And I think the emotions all come flooding back, because we're not disconnecting from the deceased. It's actually placing the deceased where they're still important, but at the same time, it leaves room for others. So it's, somebody once told me that grief doesn't diminish over time, but rather it stays the same. And it's when we get to this stage, it's where life begins to grow bigger around it. Where it begins to be okay to take pleasure in life, where we begin the process of filling that hole in our heart that was left by the person that died, by the loss that we've just encountered. So we don't move on from grief. We move forward with it. And in a way, it's this ultimate state of acceptance. So, those were the 4 tasks of grieving. But at the end of the day, I really wanted to present this to you because that is a framework, but it doesn't always work that way. It actually very rarely works that way. It's definitely not that straightforward. Remember, I said I wish that I could have some kind of way to fix it. There isn't. This illustrates how most people go through grief. It's a big mess. It's a big emotional mess. And I guess the way through it, as I said, and now, we'll touch on this a little bit later, it's to engage it. And it's to come to an understanding that being able to bounce around between hope and denial and anger and new relationships and searching and affirmation, all of these things, it's okay. It's part of the journey. Want to talk a little bit about, actually, before I do that, I do want to say, that when is it an appropriate time, or when do the flags start going up when it's not appropriate, when it's, past the point of normal grief, when it becomes complicated grief? And that's like asking how high is up. There's really no answer to that. I think, very roughly speaking, that the grief in and of itself takes months. It takes 3 months. It can take 6 months if it's a significant other, if it's the loss of a child. It can take upwards of a year. And again, the goal isn't to grieve right. It's to grieve well. It's to give yourself the permission to grieve. So let's move on here and go into other dimensions of grief. I want to talk about anticipatory grief, which I think is important to mention here, that it's a period of time that the survivor begins the task of mourning, and in a way actually starts going through the different tasks that I just talked about before the actual loss definitively happens. So in the first task, of accepting that this is happening, there's awareness and acceptance of the fact that this person is going to die. The possibility of the loss just continues to grow and becomes more apparent. The second task around engaging emotions, the increase that happens of anxiety as your loved one continues to deteriorate in a way you can't help but to start to identify with the process. You actually start to think about your own mortality and, what does death mean to you? In the third task, around trying to make sense of it, one starts to wonder within anticipatory grief, different role rehearsals. What is life going to look like after this person dies? What will I do with my children? Where will we live? These are huge questions, but they're questions that come up within this phase of anticipatory grief. It becomes very challenging, and it can sometimes grow in challenge as it becomes, is it the period of time that we're in it is extended, because the longer we're in it, the harder it is to be in it. Let me just move on here to complicated grief. And this is, there's a lot of different ways of defining this. There's different authors, different people talk about it as prolonged grief, complicated grief, complex grief, compounding grief. I mean, in a nutshell, I would say that complicated grief is actually our happens when we get stuck in one of the four stages. When there's a kind of a chronic delay of the grief, when there's an exaggeration of the grief, or when we mask the grief. And that can become very destructive very quickly. And as I mentioned earlier, turning to maladaptive behaviors, turning to alcohol, turning to drugs, turning to other uh, harmful behaviors, we can easily spiral out of control. And it's definitely something to be aware of and to know to reach out for help when you start seeing these things happening. I'm just being mindful of time here. I want to move on to emotions within grief. I want to also take a minute to focus on, I know this is the community of the living donor uh, folk, and organ donation in and of itself is such a complex process. There are so many layers that a person can go through with regards to grief. I think that what makes things very complicated when dealing with organ donation and grief is the hope that is presented and is present at the very beginning of the journey. I've heard time and again folks talk about it being, a second chance at life, being such a gift, such a blessing. Their hope, their expectation, their yearning for that is just so high. And it becomes very challenging when we're faced with a different outcome. And, I think that this emotional investment in the hope, it's because it's a tangible solution to a physical illness. Oftentimes it's kind of the last line of defense. You're dealing with in transplant, you're dealing with life and death. It's as serious as a conversation can get in life. And that emotional investment that we make into it is so great because of that, because it's literally life and death. Um, and I think, it's difficult for me to talk about different scenarios within organ donation because there are so many different ways that people can engage grief through it. But I think the common denominator is the emotions that we feel. And, I know I said I wanted to focus on the four basic categories of feelings: mad, sad, glad, and afraid. But really, the two that stand out for me are anger and fear. There's not a whole lot to say about sadness because it's sad. It's natural for us to feel that sadness when we encounter a loss. And glad is, there's not a whole lot of joy that happens when loss occurs in our life, other than when we can potentially feel some relief if the person has been suffering or has been going through a really difficult time in life. So the two that I think really stand out are anger and fear. And the kind of two traditional sources of anger come from by the person that's survived, or by the bereaved, is that this sense of helplessness. There was nothing more that I could do to help with the situation. And in a way that there's a place for that anger. That anger does need to be acknowledged. It's our kind of It's a normal human reaction. It's a normal human response. The other from a spiritual lens, that this anger with God or a deity, that we start to question our faith. How could God let this happen? My wife, my husband, my child, they were such a good person. It's not fair. And it's not. It's not. I think it's oftentimes people that, the folks that I encounter at bedside, they're actually really afraid to talk about their anger at God because they don't think it's right. And this is, remember, I talked about the determinants of grief. This fits in there very well. But talking about it, engaging this anger, is what you need to do to process the anger. Um, Fear. I want to take a quote from C.S. Lewis here from his book, Grief Observed, that no one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. I'm not afraid, but then the sensation is like being afraid, the same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness. It's there. And I think that fear is there because there's a lot of uncertainty that happens. You remember I talked about the whole aspect of redefining yourself as the one that survives this person, as the need for rebuilding a new image of yourself. It's scary because that's a big task that's ahead of you. Other feelings that come up: fatigue, helplessness, shock, yearning, numbness. These feelings also never happen in silos. It would be very nice if we can say, today I'm going to confront my anger and only focus in on my anger. Today I'm only going to focus in on my fear. It doesn't work that way. Often or always, it's a combination of these feelings. And it's important to engage them, and I don't think I mentioned this yet, but again, something that I often find myself saying to folks is, we feel how we feel. It's not right or wrong. We have to let ourselves feel it. We have to let go of the judgment of feeling wrong or feeling out of place. It's okay to feel how you feel. It's all valid and it's all okay. And it's about engaging those feelings. And this is what I mean about it being a ball of emotions. Often it's all of these things at the same time: rage, anxiety, sadness, panic, dismay, sorrow, denial at the heart of it all. This is grief. It's very tough. I'm, again, just being mindful of time. I'm going to very quickly go into a couple of things that I think would be helpful to engage grief. I found that writing a letter, if that's something that you've been able to do in your life, write a letter to yourself. Was there something you wanted to say to the person that you didn't have a chance to say? What did this person mean to you? You can do it diary style, where you don't share it with anybody. You can, type it on a computer and delete the file after. You can burn it, you can shred it, you can get rid of it if you want to. But I think that helps to, again, engage the feelings that are inside of you and not just focus on facts. Facts are good, but also being mindful of focusing on the feelings. What are you feeling about this person? What are you feeling in the moment? Another, just very quickly, an activity that I think can be very helpful and meaningful, creating a memory box, finding a box around the house, even a shoe box that you can decorate, maybe collecting things that remind you of the person, putting it in the box, decorating the box, and then putting the box in a place where you can access it. And when you're feeling sad or when you want to remember the person, you have access to that box. And you can kind of re-engage some of those difficult feelings. Working on something like this, finishing the sentence. This is something I kind of just took off of Google. That things that make me feel the saddest. These are all reflective exercises that help to engage some of those deep feelings that we're harboring and keeping within ourselves when we grieve. And as a person on the giving side of maybe when you're journeying with somebody that's going through grief, I think I would say, again, doing the work that I do, is listening, being open to listening and not trying to jump at fixing the person's grief. It is so powerful to bear witness to a person's emotions, to give them the space, give them the opportunity to tell them it's okay to cry, to tell them it's okay to feel angry. And oftentimes people are afraid to do that. They're afraid of an awkward silence. And silence can be a very, very powerful thing. Obviously networking, seeking out support groups, those are all very powerful things. We never get over grief. We don't get over grief. We learn to live with it, and it becomes a part of our life story. I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation here. I know that we're also coming to the end of our time. I wanted to take a moment to also share a poem with you guys by Eloise Cole, and it's titled Falling Apart. I seem to be falling apart. My attention span can be measured in seconds. I cry at the drop of a hat. I forget things constantly. The morning toast burns daily. I forget to sign the checks. Half of everything in the house is misplaced. Feelings of anxiety and restlessness are my constant companions. Rainy days seem extra dreary. Sunny days are an outrage. Other people's pain and frustrations seem insignificant. Laughing, happy people seem out of place in my world. It has become routine to feel half crazy. I am normal, I am told. I am a newly grieving person. So Candace, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. Just again, very quickly, these are some of the online resources that I've come up with. They offer, I know that the first one, Jewish Family and Child Services, is going to be offering group therapy in January. You don't, and often these religious organizations don't require you to be of the faith, or it's not really faith-based. It's just a social service that they provide. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I think everybody is definitely going to take away a lot from your presentation today. And I know for myself, a friend of mine had once told me that, grief is, something that comes in waves, and that it's often, some days it's forgotten and you're able to go on your day and try to live in that normal space, and other days, it hits you like a giant wave that you're trying to get back up to the surface. So having these tips for when those days come, or when we're in the deepest part of it, I think are really important, and knowing who we can reach out to when we're going through this is particularly critical. So I also want to echo that if anybody today, or anybody that needs that support, please feel free to reach out to the center. We're always available, and we can always refer you as well to either Stefan or his group, or other places that Stefan has mentioned as well, because we know that this can be a difficult time of year for many people. And so please reach out. We are happy to connect you with others. And I want to also introduce one other speaker here. I'll ask Sue if she can turn on her video, if she's able to. Hi, Sue.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. So
Thank you
Sue
for having me.
Morrison-Weir is joining us today. She's going to talk a little bit about her journey with grief and how she turned her family's tragedy and loss into new life, and speaking about some of her tips that she may have for us and how she really managed this journey. So thank you so much for being so open and sharing your story, Sue. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. I apologize for being a little bit late. So unfortunately, I didn't get to hear all of the presentation, but I was sort of nodding my head in agreement with everything that was being said, all of the feelings and the talking to people and writing letters, and they were all just resonating with me as something that advice I have given or something that I went through myself. In 1998, my husband passed away quite unexpectedly at the age of 33. He was the first person in my life that was very close to me to pass away. So I had not experienced grief significantly before. I had just lost sort of my husband's grandmother, whom I wasn't very close to, had passed away. So I really didn't understand the grief journey in any way whatsoever. And then, of course, there's the decision making that is unique to someone close to you, for instance, arranging the funeral. And I remember sitting at the table with the funeral director. He wanted me to pick out a casket. And I said, I don't know what he would have wanted, because the person that I need to ask is the person who isn't here. And it was just all such a struggle every day, trying to get through the day. And I had 2 young children at the time, and I think, honestly, they were my saving grace, because I did not have the opportunity to crawl into bed and pull the covers over my head, which I so gratefully would have enjoyed for a time anyway, but I would have just been hiding. But I did have to get up every day, and I did have to go to work, and it does take an incredible toll on you in so many ways. Physically, I think I lost 20 pounds, and it wasn't because I wasn't eating. It's just that grief is an all-consuming physical aspect of your being. And it is just waking up every day and getting through every day, 1 minute at a time, 1 second at a time, if that's what it is. And you just somehow keep moving forward. All the firsts are really, really hard for every special occasion, of course, because you expect your loved one to be there with you. Christmas in particular, and we are coming up on that, is always a tough one. For me, I decided to sit down and write a letter to my husband. I did it Christmas Eve after the kids went to bed, and I just poured my heart out and cried like crazy. And I sealed the letter and I put it on the Christmas tree, and I've never opened it. I still have it. I put it in with his box of things that I kept, and it is still there. I don't remember what I wrote, because who remembers most of what they did in the beginning of grief. One thing I do remember is it changed my personality a little bit, my humor, I should say. I developed a dark humor for a little bit of time, and I think I offended people a little bit with my humor. For instance, at the funeral, my best friend's sister came up to me and said, "You look beautiful." And I said, "Thank you. I am the new model for Widows Weekly." And she was mortified. And I just, I don't know why, but I just found that my humor was a little dark. And speaking to other people, I think that they have also experienced the same things. So even though I felt a little bit like my filter was gone, I hope that people will give you a little bit of grace in understanding what you're going through. I know it's really hard. I do want to reiterate that it's important to find people that you can talk to. I do find that the people you are closest to, whether it's true or not, you feel as if you are bothering them and that you keep bringing up the same things over and over again. So it's really important to talk to someone who understands your grief. If you can find a community group, or even if you can go online and find a community group. I was able to, back in 1998, we did not have the plethora of the internet that we have right now, but I was able to connect in with a couple of grief groups that were not local, but were international, and that was fine. It, in a way, was even better because I was never going to meet anyone that I spoke to. And so I was able to say whatever I needed to say, and it was okay because I was never going to meet them in person. Yeah, it's really, it's tough. It's so hard. It's the hardest thing you'll ever go through. But on the other side, I think it's one of those difficult things that we go through in life. And in the end, it makes us who we are meant to be. I am a different person on the other side. I think a better person than I was, a kinder person, certainly, a more empathetic person. But it's really hard to go through. It's so difficult. I recently lost my grandmother, and it certainly brings up all of those emotions again. We were very close. And your relationship with the person that you lose is different. Certainly my grief with my grandmother is different than the grief with my mother, or my husband, I'm sorry. And it's a different experience all over again. So it doesn't matter if you've grieved once. Every relationship will create a different kind of grief, again, different from the last one you experienced. And we all experience grief differently. There are the stages of the grief, as have already been discussed, but you don't always experience all of them. I never experienced any anger, and I never experienced really any fear for him that he was not sick for a long period of time. It was a sudden incident, so we just were 2 days in the hospital. And for me, it was just all about the loss of his space in my life and how that impacted me. With him gone, I was no longer a wife. So who was I then? And recreating who you are is hard. It's really difficult. It is a tough journey because you don't want it. You don't want to become this other person. You liked who you were. And it's not comfortable to have to recreate who you are. But as I said, it does make you the person that you were meant to be. And in my situation, at least, it's made me a better person, I think. So I often say that in being a donor, Bill obviously gave the gift of life, but he also gave a gift to me, not only with my journey with transplantation and now working in the field with transplant patients, but also the gift of the changes that he affected in me that I will carry forever. I do have a poem that I would like to share as well. I loved that poem. It was so perfect. It perfectly outlined grief and how hard it is to get through every day, to remember to do something as simple as pay the bills or gosh, even brush your hair sometimes. Just get out of bed. This poem is called We Will Remember. I should mention it's written by Dr. Alan Wolfelt, and he is an incredible grief counselor in the States. He actually, I believe it's in Colorado, he has a grief center there, and he has incredible online resources, and I believe he also has online grief services. It's called We Will Remember. In the rising of the sun and its setting, we will remember. In the blowing of the wind and the chill of winter, we will remember, or we remember. In the warmth of the sun and the peace of summer, we remember. In the rustling of the leaves and the beauty of autumn, we remember. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember. So long as we live, they too shall live, for they are a part of us as we remember. There isn't a point in life when they will never not be a part of your life. I think of my husband, obviously, I don't think of him every moment of the day, but he is a part of who I am. And so he is a part of everything that I do. And I'm sorry, I'm not getting emotional. The love never goes away, and he is always here. Thank you for having me, Candace.
Thank you so much. Really grateful for your words today and for your strength in sharing with us, and for that beautiful poem that you shared for us all to take away with us. It's very difficult to go through this at this time of year as well. So I can't thank you enough for sharing with us and being so vulnerable, because you know, hearing from other people really does help other people to get through this, no matter how long ago it was, you know, whether it was days or years, it always stays with us. So thank you so much for sharing with us and for helping heal many of us as well. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have many thanks in the chat as well for you. So we don't have much time left. Does anybody have any questions that you wanted to ask Stefan or Sue? If there aren't any questions, what we can also do is email people some links people can reach out to as well. But please, as Sue stated, as Stefan stated, as I'm going to state again, please reach out to people as you're dealing with grief. Please reach out to us if we can help you in any way, no matter what kind of grief you're dealing with right now. As Stefan said, there's no right way to grieve. We just want to help you through this journey. So please reach out to us, and we're available at any time if you need us. So thank you so much for joining today, and we truly appreciate our wonderful speakers. Thank you. Stefan, are you still there as well?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. I think people are just